What's up, guys? It's Worlds time, and you all know what that means. Another round of analysis from your favorite, or maybe not so favorite, analyst on Reddit. But this time you get it in video form, so if you can't read, this is for you. Today, we're going to be talking about NA. Yup, that's right. Light some candles up if you're from the US or Canada, because this is going to be a bumpy ride, and it's probably going to be pretty depressing. A lot of people are asking why NA sucks so much, and while the cultural aspects are probably an entirely different video that I could cover, I thought we would just do better by focusing on the gameplay today. So without further ado, let's look at NA's 1 seed, Cloud9, what they did wrong, and what their prospects for the future are. First game we're going to look at is their first game against Fnatic. If we just go through the order of their picks and bans, I think what Cloud9 is doing makes a lot of sense. When they B1 Sejuani, they leave themselves in an open position and just get a little bit more information before they decide what champions they're going to be picking. This is very much in the Cloud9 style, where they seem to not really have set blue side drafts. They like to play it along as they go, look for these counter picks, and you see this immediately where once Fnatic locks in the Maokai Aphelios, they take a bot lane that has a lot of kill pressure, a lot of playmaking, and that can potentially have a lot of priority in the MF Nautilus. This gives Cloud9 a huge initiation combo between the Sejuani and the Nautilus, and if they can get an early lead, they can really just hammer in this pick game or this neutral skirmish game because Nautilus Sejuani offers so much for the team. Fnatic, on the other hand, just pretty much take a really wide open stance to the draft, picking not necessarily to scale, not necessarily to win early game, but just having flexibility with the Azir, with the Aphelios, with the Maokai. These are all solid options. They give you solid scaling, but they also have a solid early mid game if that's what you're going for. Although with the MF and the Nautilus, you would imagine that Fnatic likely is going to play it more to scale and front to back than they are to contest early game against Sejuani Nautilus. Now going into the R4, they keep up with this kind of scaling theme. The Renata is both a really good champion into the Cloud9's opening 3, as Sejuani Nautilus are obviously going to be looking to go forward into you, looking for those engages, and Renata can both buff either of the hyper carries that Fnatic has, or just disengage and buy them time. And Cloud9, seeing this from Fnatic, seeing that they're going for this kind of late game team fight, decide to really just hammer in on their own strengths. So they blind Fiora topside, which is likely going to be the center of where they're going to want to play around with a LeBlanc. And now LeBlanc into Azir isn't really a pushing lane for the LeBlanc early game, but if they get enough gank pressure on the Azir, which they certainly can do with the Sejuani jungle, that really opens them up to either making bot roams or maybe diving the top lane, which is Wonder's Ornn. And they'll be able to blow the game wide open. You would assume with Fiora, with LeBlanc, with Sejuani, they have a really strong neutral contest in the first 10 minutes. They should be getting the first Herald. They should be getting the first Dragon. They should be able to put themselves in a winning position and then be able to win through the playmaking from these champions of LeBlanc, Sejuani, and Nautilus. They have a really clean-cut win condition, which is to get ahead early, take territory around the map so that Fnatic can't move around or farm freely, and then just snowball that lead into a victory. So all in all, I think that Cloud9 walks away with this draft pretty happy. You know, they have 2 pushing lanes in the Fiora into Ornn and the bot lane. They have a very volatile mid lane that they can snowball in their favor with the 2 pushing lanes, and they have the advantage in the early mid game. It's just a question of whether or not they can perform on that. I don't think the draft is why they lost the first game, and once we get into the gameplay, I'm going to be explaining why I think it's mostly on Cloud9's play. The game starts off pretty much as ideally as you could want for Cloud9, between Blabber managing to blow Wonder's flash top early, and then them securing a kill in their winning 2v2 bot lane off of a good hook by Sven. Though I will say the C9 bot lane seems to be playing relatively risk averse. I don't see Sven walking forward very much, looking for these angles, looking for these hooks, and the one that he did find was one where they were very much pushed under turret and looked just very opportunistic. Now, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but Nautilus MF has a much stronger level 1, level 2 than would Renata Aphelios. So you would kind of expect them to be the lane with the push prio here, especially if the MF is taking the E and trying to push the lane early, but that's not really what happens. The first major wrinkle, though, happens at 4:35, where if you look at the map, Blabber pops a Scryer's Bloom on the top side, and this reveals himself because Fnatic can see the plant be popped, and then he also reveals himself on the ward. So what knowledge this gives Fnatic is, first off, that Blabber hasn't based yet, and second, he has enough CS where it's likely that he's full cleared, so he's either going to go top, look to see if there's an opportunity, and then base, or he's going to be basing and going bot lane to the red side jungle. So this is why you see when Blabber makes that rotation around bot lane to see if there's an angle for a lane gank, Hylissang and Upset are just giving ground to Berserker and Sven, who are kind of telegraphing the gank a little bit by walking a lot more forward than they usually are. So at this point, this is already pretty bad for Cloud9 because their bot lane doesn't have push, and Fnatic knows exactly where Blabber is going to be for the next minute or so. Add to that the fact that they don't have mid lane prio, and you have the first huge problem that occurs into this game, which is that the lower quadrant of the jungle is compromised in the first 5 minutes. You see Razork going directly for this aggressive contest on the chickens, and this is because he knows his bot lane is pushing, his mid lane is pushing. If they get into a skirmish here, his team is the one that moves first. And in spite of this, Cloud9 goes for this fight in the jungle, and I would say Jensen makes a pretty comically bad and greedy play trying to kill the Maokai, because, you know, he's just not going to do it. Like, I have to hammer in how bad this individual play is, because even if he gets the quote-unquote kill here, unless he can secure it without using W, which is really hard because it's Maokai, the Renata is close enough to the play where you're going to assume the Maokai is going to get bailouted, and the LeBlanc is probably going to die in the aftermath anyway. Most of the time that ends in a 1-for-0, where Jensen dies and doesn't even get a kill. In spite of this, he goes in trying to greed for this kill, trying to outplay the situation, and what happens is he has to blow everything, and he also loses just about everything. He has about 2.5 waves pushed under his turret that he just can't farm because he can't stay in lane. He no longer has flash to make aggressive plays, and their mid lane is basically just going to be AFK for the next few minutes while Jensen tries to recover. But in spite of this, like, the game still looks completely manageable for Cloud9. They still get the first turret, they get all 5 plates top, they get both heralds, they get a dragon, and they have a respectable 1.5k gold lead by 15 minutes. By all accounts, that's a winnable position. That's a position that's pretty good. Could it have been better? Yeah, but you're not going to complain about that kind of position. The problem here is, once they get to this point in the game, they just don't do anything. If you look at the vision differential at 17 minutes in, you'll notice that Cloud9 has effectively no forward vision. They don't have any aggressive territory to play around to generate picks. And like I was talking about when I was breaking down the draft, this is a composition that really wants to accelerate in the mid game, that really wants to use the LeBlanc, the Sejuani, and the Nautilus to be accelerating their lead. So the fact that they don't even have any vision to set up for the play, and that Fnatic has completely compromised their red side jungle with a huge amount of wards down there, is kind of telling towards how this game is going to go. Cloud9 is not the ones in control of the game, even though they really should be. This ultimately culminates into the play that, in my mind, kind of ends the game, where Razork hits a really nice Maokai ulti down to trap them between the Maokai ulti and the double TP underneath them, and then from there, Cloud9 kind of just gets into a hole where they can't really recover because their champions are just outvalued at this point, and they never really leverage the lead that they had. So if we review this game, what happened is Fnatic played a really controlled game that played around vision really well, but Cloud9 never really used the tools that they got out of draft in any way whatsoever. When you play something like the Sejuani Nautilus LeBlanc, you have to be always moving around the map and always creating these scenarios where Fnatic is afraid or giving things up because they don't have enough control. And if you look at the way that the map is set up, even when Fnatic has the early game lead, I'm just not seeing that. So this is starting to go into one of the main things that I've seen about Cloud9's play, which maybe this is a bad habit that they picked up domestically, but they're really content to just try to take the small leads that they get and then coast off of it into a win, which ultimately is relying on the enemy team to mess up rather than Cloud9 to do a positive play. And this might work to win NALCS, but it's not going to win you Worlds games. The amount of punishment that you get for misplays against the best teams in the world is just in an entirely different league than what's going to happen domestically, which is why you see when they don't get the forward vision that they need to with their comp, they immediately lose a team fight and pretty much lose the game. On top of that, I think this game is also just a confluence of the issues that a lot of people are pegging on Cloud9 through the tournament so far. Too much ego, too little to back it up. If you want to see how a draft of this style can or should be played, you should look at the game that happens right after this between EG and T1. And if you just compare the map vision post-15 between the two, I think you'll realize just how passively Cloud9 is playing their position. Cloud9 is kind of acting like they're so much better than Fnatic. They don't need to do anything because Fnatic is just going to implode. And that type of disrespect really, really bites them in the back. On top of that, in spite of picking these matchups that theoretically should be somewhat winning, they never really secure a huge advantage off of that. Fudge does obviously get the full turret, 2 plates, but he's also even in CS with Wonder. And if you watch, again, the matchup between Zeus and Flandre, Flandre is having a much worse time than going even in CS and losing his turret. Then we get into the second game that they have against EDG, and I'm just going to say this right now, but this game is outright doomed in draft. Like, I don't know what Max Waldo was trying to go for with this comp. Well, actually, I kind of do get what he's going for, but I just don't think that it's going to work against a team like EDG. So you have Cloud9 opting into the carry versus carry matchup with Fudge on Fiora into Aatrox, and just to clear up a common misconception, I know a lot of people seem to think that Fiora is this Aatrox counter pick. She is to an extent, to the extent that she can start winning the 1v1 after 1 to 1.5 items. She can get the push early once he blows his passive, maybe uses a Q, because her level 1 is a lot stronger. But after level 5, there really isn't much of a lane advantage for Fiora. I would call it mostly a skill matchup because of the trade-up time Aatrox has relative to her. You're basically going to go even up until you get to a certain point, and that's not even factoring in junglers, because Aatrox obviously has better setup for his jungler than a Fiora does. So it's mostly a wash. I wouldn't really call it a counter. I would call it like a check at best. But the other part is, I know a lot of people are really like hammering in on Fudge for this one pick because he already couldn't get much of a lead on an Ornus Fiora, which after watching Zeus the game right after that they had, you kind of are feeling, you know, what is this guy doing? He can't play the champion. And I will say that we need to remember that at the end of the day, this is a game that's being played by human beings. And you can't really just lose one game where your top laner could have just had a bad game on Fiora and then just scrap everything and say, oh yeah, we're just going to put you on Ornn duty for the rest of the tournament. You're not allowed on carries ever again. tough luck, buddy. Like, that is both bad for team chemistry and assuming you're actually a good team, which I guess is contentious at this point, but assuming you think you are a good team that can win games, it's just not worth it to completely warp your strategy around one bad loss, right? Even so, the Fiora is not really why I hate this draft, I'm just bringing it up. So the reason I hate this draft is because they take Victor into Azir plus Poppy, which already feels really dangerous because Victor is this immobile mage, and as we've seen throughout this tournament, Azir Poppy is a really kind of deadly gank combo. So you're already giving EDG like this flaming target in the mid lane after Azir hits 6. Then I think they make the draft even worse when they go into an R4 Shinzao. Now, I know we can like retroactively look at the rest of the draft and be like, oh, the Shinzao is actually pretty good, you know? The Azir and the Jinx are these big range threats, and the Shinzao can kind of frontline for Cloud9 and knock away the Poppy and the Aatrox and absorb a lot of damage from the Azir. You can't make that argument because Cloud9 picks at R4 before the Jinx is even locked. But also, it's just a bad champion into Poppy and Aatrox, and its utility into Azir is going to be a bit overstated when you realize that half of the Azirs at this tournament aren't really playing Azir as this kind of backline hyper carry. A lot of the time he's being played as a facilitator or a primary engager. Just look at the way Showmaker and Scout have been playing it throughout the tournament. They're not really going for this late game carry style. They're the playmaker for their team. So in that case, most of the time, Azir is going to be inside of the Crescent Strike when Shinzao uses it. But again, they also didn't pick Jinx and Thresh on the second rotation until the Shinzao was even locked. So the argument that it makes a good frontline for this huge backline is not really existing here. On top of that, the question you have to ask if you're gonna play Shinzao, and if you're gonna go for this kind of skill matchup, carry versus carry top lane between Aatrox and Fiora, is with this kind of draft, why are you picking Victor in the first place, right? We have Fiora, we have Shinzao, and for some reason we're picking a stagnant farming control mage mid that's not going to be able to play around the game plans of either of these champions because Azir will always be moving first. Azir usually gets pushed in the early game, and Victor is kind of just this control mage that needs to farm up to 2 to 3 items before it does anything, right? So if you're going to be playing Shinzao plus Fiora, plus all of these other champions like the Aphelios, that can have so much priority early game if you play around it with Gravitum, why are you picking Victor and not, say, Talia or LeBlanc or even Ahri, or as Faker showed against Cloud9 in the game that they play after this, Lissandra, right? All of these champions are a lot better at setting up, I think, what Cloud9 is trying to go for here, but the Victor is just really weird fitting into the rest of their comp. So the last issue here is that when they R5 Tahm Kench, like, Blabber is pretty much in purgatory because none of his lanes have setup. Victor does not set up for a Shinzao. Tahm Kench does not really set up well for a Shinzao. Shinzao kind of has the burden to make the entire play by himself. And Fiora also doesn't have setup for Shinzao. What a coincidence, right? So Blabber has this immense amount of pressure to try to create early game because Cloud9 is also outscaled later on by EDG's composition. They kind of have this death ball front to back team fight comp with the Jinx, the Azir, and the Aatrox. So when you pick this kind of Shinzao with 3 lanes that don't really have setup but also gets outscaled, the question is, how do you win the game? And the answer is, like, Blabber better smurf real hard on EGG, because I don't know how you get a lead with this team. There's just no positive playmaking here. The only playmaker on the entire team is Blabber Shinzao, right? Because Victor doesn't create plays for himself. Fiora doesn't create plays for himself. I guess Aphelios maybe can kind of create plays for himself if he hits a Gravitum ulti, but if you're relying on Aphelios for playmaking, you can already see why I don't like this draft. It's just too passive and too much, again, reliant on your opponents messing up rather than you doing stuff proactively. And that's not going to work against the best teams in the world. Now, I know, or I would guess that the thought process behind this draft that Max Waldo or whoever picked it had is just that this is like a very strong kite back team comp. And in, like, I guess in a vacuum you can evaluate it as that, because Victor and Aphelios and Tam Kench are these champions that are really good when the enemy team is running at you. Xin Zhao can provide the spacing for that, but I have a huge issue with that, which is that if you're playing a no-engage kiteback comp like that, like maybe with Caitlyn Lux or something like that, you need lanes that are going to win. And the reason you need lanes that are going to win is because in order to actually create fights to progress the game state, you have to be able to take early neutral objectives with that type of draft, right? You don't have to initiate if the enemy team is pressured into initiating on you, but in order to pressure the enemy team to initiate on you, you have to be in the lead in the first place. And Cloud9's draft doesn't get in the lead in the first place unless Blabber plays the best game of his entire life, which obviously doesn't happen. The early game for this game kind of highlights everything I just mentioned. You see Blabber get his position compromised early after JJ pops a Scryer's Bloom, revealing Cloud9's empty blue side. And you also kind of just get the feeling that EDG knows where Blabber is going to be because he doesn't have a lot of lanes to play around, and the top side is going to be the most volatile lane matchup. That's why Scout pulls more further to his right side than his left side and is able to avoid the first gank attempt without blowing anything. Then you have Fudge on the top side, who has pushed his lane, meaning that Xin Zhao can't do anything there, and the problems are only going to get worse because, again, this is a comp that's kind of on a timer, even though it doesn't have any early game playmaking. So when EDG botches the level 6 gank onto the Victor, which was pretty predictable to happen because, again, Azir Poppy is this really deadly combo if you're playing an immobile control mage. Cloud9 gets the window to kind of come back into this game if they can get the kill here, but they don't, and then they keep chasing. And I know Blabber autos a ward here, and I know he probably gets the kill if he doesn't auto the ward, but what you have to understand is even if Blabber gets the kill, this position is completely compromised. Their bot lane is pushed in, their top laner is getting pushed in. Neither of their side is going to roam first, and you actually see Flandre and Mako are both making it to this play way, way, way before their counterparts. Even if Blabber gets the kill on Poppy, he's probably still going to die here. Jensen is guaranteed dead because he's getting 1v1 on the side. This at best is going to go for a 1-for-2, or if maybe Blabber finds out some way to get out, it's a 1-for-1, which, again, still not great, right? You're not really looking for that. So, but that's not even what happens, right? Blabber misses the kill, and the fight just goes disastrously because everybody has to blow flash to get away. They give a double kill to the Azir, and EDG was going to play around this Azir in the first place. They basically had just no positioning on the map whatsoever. Their main playmaker just died because the Xin Zhao didn't survive. And after this point, and I know it's a skirmish at 6 minutes, but legitimately after this point, I just don't think Cloud9 can win. They are too far behind. EDG has way more avenues to play around, and Blabber is just not going to 1v9 this game no matter how good you think he is. It's just too much on his plate. He doesn't have a single lane with setup. Right? I don't like these drafts fundamentally because I think you have to have some sort of thing to play around, and a Xin Zhao going EQR into the enemy team is not really something to play around. Not to mention, this comp isn't even good at being a kite-back comp that wins off neutrals. I just think they lost in draft, and because they lost in draft, a single bad skirmish at 6 minutes costs them the entire game. If you want to say that ego and bad play cost Cloud9 the first game, which I don't necessarily agree with, but if you want to say that, good for you. I would say just bad drafting and not great play cost them the second one. There's not a lot to talk about here. You just don't want to put that much onus on a single Xin Zhao and then expect to win the game. Because, like, even if you swap out Blabber for Prime Canyon or Prime Bengi, I don't think either of them can just pull this game out. Because Cloud9's ostensibly just playing a rollover and die comp, which is why they just roll over and die. They don't have playmaking. If this comp gets behind and it's not particularly good at getting ahead, it has no way to come back into the game. Finally, we're going to be looking at Cloud9 versus T1, and again, I think Cloud9's draft here is completely fine, but I think it might be a case of right draft for the wrong players. Because Jax into Aatrox isn't a particularly winning matchup for the Jax. Much like the Fiora, it's going to be hard for the Jax to play the game, especially after Aatrox hits level 5 and has those 3 points in queue. But unlike the Fiora versus Aatrox, Jax has even less to play around here. In all honesty, it's mostly a losing lane matchup where Jax survives and then eventually outscales in the side lane. But that's not really ideal if you're playing against Zeus, right? Because this is either who most people have and who has honestly shown that he deserves this title of either being the second best top laner at the tournament or the best top laner at the tournament. So we're opting into carry versus carry in those circumstances where our carry, despite being picked later, is also in a not great matchup, right? It's just kind of weird. You would probably need Fudge to be 369 or a player who is like of similar skill level to Zeus to be able to pull this off without getting really, really far behind. And I'm not saying that as a knock to Fudge, right? It's not that big of a shame to be a worse top laner than Zeus, but we kind of need realistic expectations for what we're going to get out of draft. And I don't think Fudge Jax versus Zeus Aatrox is going to put us in a winning position. That aside, I actually really like Cloud9's draft. The Poppy to combo with Azir, demonstrated beautifully in the EDG game against them, is just really good. Tristana into Kaisa on the R4 gives Cloud9 2-lane push because that's traditionally a counter matchup into the Kaisa. Even with the Alistar to neutralize the Leona, Tristana's going to be pushing in, and you can't imagine the Alistar and Leona are even going to be staying in lane for the most part. Both of them are just going to be moving around. So you have this 2-lane push between mid and bot, and very clear avenues to get ahead, very clear playmaking between the Azir, between the Leona, even between the Poppy. And the only liability here is the topside matchup. So I think ideally what you do with this draft is you say, okay, Jax is going to be targeted for this entire game. We can't really afford to invest too many resources there because the side of the map that we want to play around is the bot side. So hopefully Fudge can kind of weather the storm, gracefully lose this lane, which honestly he's pretty good at doing. Fudge is not the worst weak side player. He's pretty good at it. But, well, if we go into the game later on, and I'll talk about this, that's not really what happens. Another issue, which going back to this idea of right comp, wrong players, is Cloud9, I think, to my knowledge, is a team that really likes to play around topside. Fudge has one of the highest jungle proximities in all of LCS. So I don't know why, if they wanted to play that the way they do in the game, which, again, we'll get into later, they didn't pick a better matchup for Fudge and Aatrox. Now, I don't know if there is one. Certainly, most people at the tournament are having a really hard time finding one. But if that's the case, why not just take the Aatrox or ban it, right? So there was a pretty easy path to victory. Well, maybe calling it easy is a stretch, but there was a clear path to victory here for Cloud9. But in all honesty, they mostly ignored it and kind of played their own game, and their own game plan wasn't particularly good. The game starts, and Cloud9 is just already investing a lot into topside to try to salvage Fudge's lane because he puts himself in this pretty bad push early on where the lane is going to get frozen if he doesn't get help. He's just going to get ganked and die, and Blabber is kind of forced to go top to break this freeze after he gets his flash blown by Owner because he's pushing in. So already not ideal because, again, you don't want to play around the Jax in this draft. You want to play around Tristana, Leona, and the Azir so that they get freed up to move around the map. Topside can lose a little if the exchanges that you're very strong playmaking carries, the Azir, the Tristana, and the Leona, are able to move around the map and get objectives for you while the top side is losing, right? But because he kind of misplays in the lane, Blabber has to come top, and all of the attention goes top lane, which gives Owner and T1 mostly free reign over the entire bot side of the map. Making this problem even worse is that Jensen, for some reason or another, has decided to just play really passively for the whole tournament. He greeds his teleport, and you can actually see this. He doesn't base for a really long time. And normally that's fine, but with the tempo that T1 is playing at, it's really not, because he's letting himself get shoved under by the Lissandra, who has a very clear target to roam towards because Zeus is already smashing this lane. And so when Blabber gets forced top again to cover because Zeus is in a position where they could potentially kill him, well, Lissandra's already there, and the Azir is still farming under his turret because he wanted to base on a better item, I guess. So, I mean, all of this basically just culminates in Cloud9's everything getting diffed, right? Their bot side gets behind because they didn't get any attention from their own jungler. They did get attention from the enemy jungler. Their mid laner, for some reason, is just AFK farming the entire game, and their top side is just getting completely smashed. I don't even think T1 played this game, like, particularly... I mean, they played well, obviously, and I'm not trying to take that away from them. I just don't think they did anything special. I just think Cloud9 kind of got ran over because they picked a draft that wants to do one thing and then played it a completely different way towards a matchup that wasn't winning in the first place, and is probably even exacerbated by just who is piloting the champions on both sides. So, like, I mean, you pick Leona and Azir, and neither of the champions ever do anything. And this is a huge problem that is consistent across all three of Cloud9's games that they've played. If you remember the first game, they pick the Nautilus, and they pick the LeBlanc, and they pick the Sejuani, and they don't do anything with it. They get a lead, and then they just sit back and lose the game. In the second game, they draft this kind of composition that doesn't do anything, and then they lose. And in the third game, they don't, again, play around the lanes that can do stuff for them. They just don't seem to put a lot of priority on playmaking. I know a lot of people will blame Thudge for this game. He does hold a decent amount of the responsibility. He does mess up his lane state multiple times, requiring Blabber to bail him out. But on another level, that's also on the rest of their team, right? If the top laner is losing this badly, I feel like you have to cut your losses after a certain point, because it's really never going to get better. Like, T1 isn't a team of bots. They can see you going top. They can see that you're trying to salvage it. All it creates is even more playmaking potential on the top side for T1, because they can pick off people in transition, and also because you're playing around their strongest side and your weakest side. It's just a huge amount of, like, misprioritization from the top down. Obviously, Fudge is a big factor in it, but I don't really think he's the catalyst in this. He's just one part of it. That's going to be all from me for week 1. I will probably be releasing something for week 2 as well. Stay tuned. Please hit that like and subscribe button if you thought that this was at all informative or just enjoyed my commentary. And leave a comment if you think that there was something I missed or something that you disagree with. I am always down to discuss my views or just talk to people in general about the game, you know. But until I figure out what to write about next week, and you guys can make requests for me if you want, I will read those. I will see you guys next time.